Hey everybody, this is Steve. I wanted to record a short video to talk a little bit about the Biesecker piece and also about this concept of différance, which is important to understanding that. So let me first try to explain what différance is, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Biesecker piece. Okay? All right. Now, différance is this concept from Derrida about differing and deferring and how that challenges meaning, especially in terms of a structuralist understanding of language. Now, to frame that a little bit, I want to first read a little bit from my friend Terry Eagleton. This is Literary Theory and Introduction. This is at this stage, kind of an old book, but it's still, it helps sort of explain this. And what Eagleton does in this book is he talks about various sort of movements in literary criticism. This is, like I said, this is written in the 80s, so things have changed, but you get the idea. Now, talking about structuralism, he talks about a couple of different things, but I want to zoom in here on this concept of how, as Ferdinand Saussure understood structuralism in terms of linguistics, which is, he came up with this in 1916. Eagleton summarizes, each sign was meant to be seen as being made up of a signifier, a sound image, or its graphic equivalent, and a signified, the concept or meaning. The three black marks CAT are a signifier which evoke the signified cat in the English mind. So another example of that, let me use the word hat. So my vocal saying hat is a signifier. Signified. And also, this is a signified. That too is a signified, okay? So we understand that this and this are both signifieds for the signifier. I'm going to move my hair a little bit. Hat and, okay. All right. Eagleton continues. Each sign in the system has meaning only by virtue of its difference from the others. Cat has meaning not in and of itself, but because it's not cap or cat or bat or hat, for that matter. It does not matter how the signifier alters as long as it preserves its difference from all the other signifiers. You can pronounce it many different accents as long as the difference is maintained. So, in other words, we understand what a signifier is in relationship to a signified only by the differences in the words and the signifieds. Finally, Saussure believed that linguistics would get into a hopeless mess if it concerned itself with actual speech, or parole, as he calls it. He was not interested in investigating what people actually said. He was concerned with the objective structure of signs, which made their speech possible in the first place, and this he called langue. Neither was Saussure concerned with the real objects which people spoke about. In order to study language effectively, the reference of their signs, things actually denoted, had to be placed in brackets. And also, the relationship between a signifier and signified is arbitrary. In other words, there's no reason why we don't call this bat. Okay? All right. So that's thing number one. Now, along comes post-structuralism, and this is how Eagleton talks about this a little bit later on, which is cat is cat because it is not cap or bat. But how far is one to press this process of difference? Cat is also what it is because it is not cat or mat. It's not because it's not map or hat. Where is this supposed to stop? It would seem that this process of difference in language can be traced around infinitely. But if this is so, what has become Saussure's idea of language as a closed and stable system? That's where we get into this idea of différance. And before we get to that, this is how Eagleton describes the sort of problems. He says, to complicate matters even further, if there's no distinct fixed distinction between signifiers and signifieds, if you want to know the meaning or signified of a signifier, you can look it up in the dictionary, but all you'll find is more signifiers, whose signifieds you can look up, and so on. Another way of putting it, just to skip a little bit further the page here, what we've just said is that meaning is not immediately present in a sign. Since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not, Its meaning is always in some sense absent too. Meaning, if you like, is scattered or dispersed along a whole chain of signifiers. It cannot be easily nailed down. It is never fully present in any sign alone, but it is rather a kind of constant flickering of presence and absence together. Another example, when I read a sentence, the meaning of it is always somehow suspended, something deferred or still to come. One signifier relays me to another, and then to another. Earlier meanings are modified by later ones, and although the sentence may come to an end, the process of language itself does not. And just to illustrate this further, we see this in speech because I'm speaking right now and you understand the words that I'm saying, but you're not quite sure what this sentence is going to mean until I'm done, and then it's gone and too late. Okay? Now, Derrida talks about this as différance. Now, the important thing about différance, and this comes from a Derrida Reader by Peggy Kampf, which is actually a really good book if you're interested in this sort of thing, is the term itself is kind of interesting. She says, one must first of all understand this invention, because the word différance with D-I-F-F-E, little accent part mark, E-R-A-N-C-E, A-N-C-E, that's different from the French would have an E where the A is. One must first of all understand this invention in the context of the modern French language. Unlike English, French has not developed two verbs from the Latin differe, but has maintained the senses of both to differ and differ in the same verb. So it's kind of like live and live, or to point to my poster up here, the word draft, which says the examples are underneath the word draft. It says the open window caused a draft in the room, and then the next one is the writer made a first draft of his story. You know the difference from those two words based on context and just context alone. Also, unlike English, in French, no noun form from this verb carries a sense of deferral or deferment. Derrida's invented word wields together difference and deferral, and thus refers to configuration of spatial and temporal differences together. As for the ans ending, he calls up a middle voice between the active and passive voices. In this manner, it can point to an operation that is not that of a subject or of a subject on an object, that is therefore not an operation at all. Instead, there's a certain non-transitivity which Derrida suggests may well be what philosophy at its outset distributed into an active and passive voice, thereby constituting its meaning by means of repression. And so, as to underscore the relationship Derrida sees between différance and writing, in the general sense he has worked out, he recalls that which for the audience at his lecture would have found self-evident. The difference between différance and différance is silent. In other words, when Derrida was talking about différance, he doesn't make a distinction in his pronunciation between differ and defer, further highlighting the fact that these two things kind of come together. Okay? Now, that's the deal with différance. It's the concept of meaning being always a process of deferring, that is always put off, and differing, as in we know what something is because of what it is not. And these things simultaneously working together, and how that chain of signifiers of how meaning is spread out is important. My advisor for my PhD program was not very impressed with Derrida, and she always used to say stuff like, Derrida's a one-trick pony. But I gotta say, if this is the one trick, it's a pretty good trick, because it does sort of break open the idea of meaning in the sense of how we can be sure something means something, which is, of course, very important when we're talking about things like rhetorical theory and philosophy and stuff like that. So, back to Biesecker in terms of how this kind of fits in. Well, it fits in basically in two ways, and then I'll let the conversation continue after this. Biesecker points out, and then she talks about this in the first couple of pages of her essay, but I'm going to point specifically on page 114. She basically points out that the argument between Bitzer and Watts is not disputing, or for that matter, Consigny too, does not dispute the permanence and understandability of the key terms, that is, of audience, rhetor, message. In other words, those are just sort of givens, and that is not necessarily the case under difference. She says, in all, and this is about halfway through on 114, in all cases, however, critics still take as their founding presumption a causal relation between the constituent elements comprising the event as a whole. Either speaker or situation is posited as logically and temporarily prior one or the other takes its origin. That is, either the situation existed and it's filled with speech vis-a-vis Bitzer, or the speaker creates a situation vis-a-vis Bots. But one way or the other, one they presume comes before the other. The presumption discussion will not try to review this body of the present discussion will not try to review this body of arguments. Rather, will attempt to turn what appears to be an impasse into a productive contradiction, one that makes it possible to rethink rhetoric in a new way. And then to skip down a little bit, whether or not we agree with Watts' own proposition, we may at least see his essay as a successful counterstatement, that is, to Bitzer. Nevertheless, and this is the mark of the double gesture that inhabits his own writing, even as it questions the validity of Bitzer's central premise, Watts' essay simultaneously confirms it. After all, Watts' statement is a response to Bitzer's essay. Watts reads the rhetorical situation as itself a situation with an exigence that invites a response. And yet, is not Watts' own article an effect of arbitration on the part of a choosing individual? So then, is Bitzer right or is Watts right? Is situation or speaker the origin of rhetorical discourse? And then she goes on and talks about a bunch of different stuff, and I'm not going to get into the details of that now because I want you to read the essay and try to engage in it and whatnot. But just to turn over all the cards here for a second, she gets to what for me is the central point of the argument that she's trying to make about the role of something like difference and really post-structuralism generally. The idea of really questioning the stability of a rhetor, an audience, a message, and how we can, because Bitzer and Watts and Consigny all basically say, well, these are three different things that we can distinguish clearly. And Biesecker is suggesting, viewed through the lens of difference, those distinctions kind of collapse. So towards the end of this essay, page 126, she says, simply put, the deconstruction of the subject opens up possibilities for the field of rhetoric by enabling us to read the rhetorical situation as an event structured not by a logic of influence, but by a logic of articulation. If the subject is shifting and unstable, constituted in and by the play of difference, then the rhetorical event may be seen as an incident that produces and reproduces the identities of subjects and constructs and reconstructs linkages between them. From the vantage point of the decentered subject, the rhetorical event may not signify the consolidation of already constituted identities whose operations and relations are determined a priori by the logic and operates quite apart from real historical circumstances. Rather, it marks the articulation of provisional identities and the construction of contingent relations that obtain between them. So, in other words, the relationships between the parts of a rhetorical situation are fluid and are always fluid. From within the thematic of difference, we could see the rhetorical situation neither as an event that merely induces an audience to act one way or the other, nor as an incident that, in representing the interests of particular collectivity, merely wrestle the probable within the realm of the actual. Rather, we would see the rhetorical situation as an event that makes possible the production of identities and social relations. That is to say, if rhetorical events are analyzed from within the thematic of difference, it becomes possible to read discursive practices neither as rhetorics directed to pre-constituted and known audiences, nor as rhetorics in search of objectively identifiable but undiscovered audiences. In other words, not as the way Watts talks about it and not as the way Bitzer talks about it. Difference obliges us to read rhetorical discourses as a processes entailing the discursive production of audiences. In other words, we're making audiences through our rhetorical situations. It enables us to decipher rhetorical events as sites that make visible the historically articulated emergences of the category audience. So She's really kind of focused on the role of audience. One other thing I would add here, to the extent that difference and post-structuralist criticism generally is about the idea of how meaning exists on a chain of signifiers within a network. That is, that we don't understand who we are as people, who and audiences as a group or whatever, as fixed constituents, but fixed entities, but rather through a whole series of differing and deferring of meaning. Then that suggests that network relationship between constituents within a rhetorical situation are what's really important. That's going to be important as we start talking about stuff like Latour, and when we start getting into sort of the role of non-human actors in rhetorical situations. That is, it turns out that if within the network of a rhetorical situation, we also have to include a laboratory, we have to include computers, we have to include roads, we have to include signs, we have to include robots. All those elements figure into the rhetorical situation too. We are persuaded by and are persuading machines in a network not that different from the way we persuade each other. Whew, that was a mouthful. Okay, hope this helps a little bit. Read on, comment on. I'll see you online.